Now on to North Main.
So this is a very early initial look at the zoning on North Main. And we say North Main, we're kind of specifically looking at the corridor between A Street and E Street. So just north of the North Couplet to the bottom of kind of the North Main Hill. And this is related to a council goal that was established for FY14, which was to expand the perceived downtown area on Main Street from E Street to the South Couplet. And this language actually would reach from E all through downtown. I think the intent, and the South Couplet actually, when I looked at this the other day, caught me by surprise, because I would take you south of Gripman. The primary focus, as I understood and participated in the conversations with the council, was really extending it north and picking up from A Street and heading up to the north. So that's what we've been focusing on here. Through the construction of streetscape improvements, such as improvement repair of sidewalks, installation of street trees, and installation of luminaires and furnishings, and evaluation of zoning and development standards by 2016. So that was the council goal that was established. There were some fiscal resources that were identified, some staff resources, and then we had kind of a general timeline where we'd work through streetscape assessment, zoning review, project design, possible zoning revisions if necessary, and then streetscape construction possibly in 2015. So that is kind of the general outline of the council goal that was adopted by the council last year, and essentially is what's causing us to take a look at this individual area. So right now, we're just slightly behind, but we're conducting that zoning review. And we did have a prior effort that Wendy had her class take a look at, kind of the built environment really through the downtown core and on up north through North Main. I'll send that out electronically. Wendy sent it to me earlier this week, so she's got a summary report from the work that the students had done. And I don't know, Wendy, if you want to cover a summary of that.
Well, basically, the students looked at if the idea is to carry the character of the center part of downtown north, then what defines that character? And so they looked at it through a lot of lenses, counting the distance between entries to buildings and density and height to width ratios and how wide the street was, and a lot of different information, and then made some recommendations based on that. But I think the strength in their work was more in the analysis. I mean, that's kind of gives some fuel to look at to understand it. So
I did have, this is really part of the area of just a few photographs. So obviously this is heading south down the North Main Hill near Rosar. So this is kind of at E Street intersection here. So this is the beginning point of the corridor. Continuing to head south, there's the D Street intersection. We just actually shifted backwards. So there's the intersection there at D. Again, as you look, we have, obviously, this is somewhat of a traditional highway commercial corridor character. The buildings are placed well off the street line, large parking area up in front. Now, the exception to that is we do have the Anytime Fitness building across the street there. That was the old Mark IV. That building has remained and was placed up at the street line in that location. But for the most part, most of the uses, such as Walgreens on the opposite side of Rosar's on the west side, are set back from the street. As you continue to the south, we do have some buildings that are up near the property line. I think they're set back. This would be set right at the 10-foot setback requirement that is in the motor business district. So that is something we'll talk about here shortly, that there is a front setback in the motor business district of 10 feet. And so that building is right at that 10-foot. And we have other structures kind of in that corridor. They're in that placement as well. And then this is heading a little bit farther south, down near the northern portion of the North Couplet. And then this is really the primary core. So if you look down, this is Main Street, and this is where we swing around. Washington comes around the corner club, and then continues up to the north. You can see the tree canopy and some of the building massing that exists south of that A Street mark. We continue to have some reasonable massing, especially like on the Moose building on the east side. but we lose the street trees. Obviously, the roadway goes into a different configuration. It's not a somewhat narrow 2-lane roadway with parking on both sides. In this section, you're a 3-lane northbound one-way with parallel parking on each side. And so you definitely have a change of character when you leave the tree canopy and the downtown core and head north. And that's, I think this is the intent of the goal, is to try to push that farther north up Main Street. This is on Jackson as you swing Jackson departing from Main as it continues to the south, swinging to the west by St. John Hardware. And this is a view, it's a little bit jumbled view, looking at that north couplet, looking north up that streetscape. So again, we do have some buildings and structures that are reasonably close, but we also have these big cutouts where there's portions of the buildings that are set back quite some distance. And this is obviously the Corner Club, Moose Lodge building, and the Grange building. They're located up near the street there. But all the street trees, and we're into more highway-style lighting in this area, somewhat narrower sidewalks as you head farther to the north. And that's Washington, the section of Washington that heads by the recycling center from the Rosar's parking lot, and then merges into the main section of Washington. Jackson. I'm sorry, Jackson. Thank you. There's D Street as it swings into Jackson heading south. So I asked some of my staff to take a look at this area and begin to kind of get an inventory of existing land uses. Certainly when we start to look at possible changes to zoning, we want to inventory land uses. We want to identify uses that are either conforming today or non-conforming today, both in respect to the land use itself as well as the building placement. If it's within an area of a setback, is it a non-conforming structure? And we do evaluations of current zoning and the conformity of the existing uses to that zoning district, and also look at applications of other possible districts to see how the uses would be categorized under different zoning designations. So we're primarily looking at this section of Main up to this location, but there's kind of a natural divide, so we have kind of a larger area that we just inventoried. It doesn't mean that any changes need to be made in the larger area, but it just was kind of the context of what really blocked out relatively well with respect to land uses and parcel configuration and ownership. The current zoning in the area, as I mentioned, is mostly motor business, which is the brown shade. There's a small section that's actually industrial, so that's St. John Hardware, and then Grops there on the south side of A Street are kind of a small portion of industrial. There's some residential office on the section of Washington once North 95 swings back onto the Main Street alignment and Washington continues north. We have either predominantly multifamily residential, which is the green, which is R4. We have some small portions of residential office that exist on the west side of Jackson, on the west side here of Washington, and a little bit here on the other side of Jefferson. And then we transition out into the R3 district, which is the dark blue shaded, so that's getting into two-family. So we're going from the higher intensity commercial to multifamily, some residential office, into R3 outside to both the west and the east. Just south of the area is the central business district. So the CB district pretty much picks up and ends there at A Street and does not extend farther north. We also did kind of a preliminary assessment of what's really available for on-street parking. Yes, if we look at, there are some different zoning options that are available. Central business is, the zoning that's actually in the downtown core. That really functions well because there is a fairly reasonable supply of public parking available between the diagonal and the parallel and angled parking on Main Street, the two Jackson Street parking lots, and other parking facilities on side streets available in the downtown core. There is actually a fair amount of on-street parking that's available to serve the uses in the downtown core. The areas in pink are really individual spaces that are demarcated, so we really don't have a great supply of public parking in that area. This little triangle actually is excess right-of-way, so that technically could become public parking. It is used as parking. I think it's used primarily by the occupants of the building directly to the north of it. So that probably could be included. It's a fairly small triangle, and by the time you try to lay out triangles into parking lots, they don't work very well. If you actually want to stripe them out officially. People can put a lot of cars on them if they're on their own, surprisingly, but those are somewhat difficult to manage. So the available on-street parking is actually is somewhat limited in the study area. If we look at the setbacks, I think Mike indicated in the outline there are buildings that are 0 to 5 feet, 6 to 10, and again 10 or greater. 10 is our setback, front yard setback in the motor business district. So the buildings that are highlighted in red are those that don't currently comply with those setback requirements. There are some buildings like the Han, actually it's non-conforming with respect to setbacks, but it was actually granted a variance during its reconstruction to be reconstructed back up at the street front. The Anytime Fitness building was approved by the commission through a PUD, and so I would actually consider that to be a conforming building because of that approval from the PUD. So there are a few here that are probably shaded red that actually are conforming structures, but from the perspective of setback, obviously that is something that this area was obviously developed underneath different zoning designations at the time, or no zoning designations, just with the right-of-ways delineating the building walls. And so it's not surprising that we have a number of structures in the area that don't comply with that front setback requirement. Now, that doesn't mean that the building is, they can change uses, they can alter the buildings, you can update and remodel the buildings. The biggest, I guess, limitation that you encounter becoming a non-conforming structure is that if you were to be destroyed, you'd have to be reconstructed in conformance with the zoning code. So the buildings, if they were destroyed, would have to be, right now, set back 10 feet from the street line unless they were granted a variance by the city, like we did with the Han structure. And so when Han was destroyed through the fire, essentially, they would have had to shift the building back 10 feet from the back of the sidewalk, but with the variance granted, they were able to reconstruct in their prior location.
Bill, I have a question, just going back to that parking slide for a second.
Yeah.
When you look at the land use in that zone, inside the red, it's predominantly parking. I mean, it's got I bet the percentage of parking land, I realize it's private parking.
Yeah, certainly for
but if you
those
start adding up all the parking lots that go with most of those businesses,
right.
I start to wonder what's going to create the demand for more parking.
Well, the question is, would the impact of changing to a zoning district that didn't require any off-street parking?
Right.
And so what would be available in public supply if you did so? If somebody wanted to densify their property and displace parking lots with building, would we have public parking that could supply and serve those uses?
And from what you're suggesting, it's pretty difficult to provide it on street, so it would have to be probably parking lots in some way.
In the current configuration of the roadway system, other than purchase and acquisition of property to put it into public parking use, there is very limited opportunity on street.
But on that one, Bill, in some sense, while they're coded as non-conforming as if that were negative,
right.
they're closer to the streetscape that we would expect for central business districts. So in some sense, it's a positive.
Right. This is just a test against the zoning district.
I understand the test.
It's saying there's a problem with the zoning code if you want to achieve that other goal.
Right.
That's what it's saying.
Right, and an opportunity in the built environment today to move in that, make these all conform by changing the zoning code, and we start to build the streetscape back up. Right. And we have some of it. Right.
If we were to look at the uses that exist in the district, those that are in red are considered to be non-conforming. So there are three, small one here, 3 residential uses. There's also a residential use in the Stuckey silo. I don't know if that's still in use,
I'm
and
not sure.
so I don't know that this one necessarily is non-conforming. The only non-conforming aspect of it would have been the residential use in the motor business district that generally is not permissible except through planned unit development. So we have 3 residential uses, and then the majority, those that are shown as in yellow, are conditionally permitted uses or planned unit developments. That's the Anytime Fitness, that was a PUD. The recycling center is not a specifically permitted use by right. It's operating underneath a conditional use permit. And then we have a daycare facility, actually 2 of them operating in the Grange building. And again, daycares are pretty much a conditional use in most all zoning districts that we have. And so, that's not an unusual circumstance. So for the most part, the uses are largely conforming, with the exception of some of these smaller residential homes that are still within that core and being utilized for residential purposes. If we were to look at the general business district, there probably are 3 different districts you could evaluate. The central business district could be one, just the expansion of CB up to the north. The general business district is another. GB is essentially like the central business district. There are no setbacks. The uses are fairly similar, with the exception that you have to provide off-street parking. So GB is intended to be around the periphery of the downtown core, but you are now distant away enough from public parking facilities that parking needs to be provided on the property to serve the use.
Doesn't residential have to be either behind or on top of
In the CB,
retail?
in the central business district, residential uses have to be either above or behind commercial uses. In the GB, residential uses are just a conditionally permitted use. So you don't have the limitation of having to be above or behind. And so GB is kind of slightly like CB with some modest variations. The one benefit of the GB is that there are no setback requirements. And so if you're looking at the building placement, that does address that individual issue. It also introduces a couple other complications, that you have some land uses in the area that would not be conforming with the GB zone. So the most significant one is the Han rental. Obviously, St. John's is, but that doesn't necessarily have to be zone general business at this point in time. I mean, St. John's can continue to operate in that location. It could be left as industrial as it is today. So I don't want to emphasize that large block of red as being necessarily a bad thing. We're really focusing on Main Street. So this is just looking for to apply GB over the entire area, and it wouldn't have to take that form. We really don't have the recycling center as a use in the GB district, so it becomes non-conforming as well.
Why wouldn't Han be a conforming use in the general
Equipment
business?
rental is not a listed permissible use in the GB district, which is kind of unusual. That is just somewhat of an anomaly. So Han is probably the largest non-conformity that you would have that would be created. Gas stations are a conditionally permitted use in the GB district, as they are in the CB district. So the station at the corner would become somewhat legal non-conforming, although they are a conditionally permissible use. So they could prospectively seek a CUP to reestablish the status, but without the CUP, they'd be kind of a legal non-conforming use.
Right, so if the place ever blew up, they'd have to get a
They would have to get a
conditional use
CUP,
permit to
correct. And the residential uses, again, are a conditionally permitted use, so those, again, are kind of in that same status. They would be improving from a non-conforming use without any opportunity to gain a conforming status absent a PUD, which isn't really going to fit for those individual small homes. So their position would actually improve with the ability to obtain a conditional use permit for that use. Until they did, they would just be a legal non-conforming use until that time. We also looked at the urban mixed commercial designation, the UMC district that was primarily developed for the Legacy Crossing area. And again, the most significant issues are Han. We did not list tool and equipment rental facilities in Legacy Crossing, and we did actually excluded gas stations, fueling stations in the UMC. Those are probably two of the most recent, well, with any time as well, significant investments in that area, and so that certainly would be a concern that we would have of placing them into a non-conforming status where they would not have any opportunity to gain back to the same position. And then we also have the transmission, repair facility located here that also is not within the UMC and not within the general business district as well. So those would be considered non-conforming uses. And again, St. John, but that would not necessarily have to be included. The Anytime Fitness would become a conforming use even without the PUD because of the fact that they vertically mixed projects are permitted use in the UMC district. So they become legally permitted at that time. So that's an initial review. The central business, I thought we had a slide for CB, is essentially the same as GB with the exception of the residential uses that are on the ground floor would become non-conforming. They wouldn't even be conditionally permitted unless they're above or behind a commercial use, and those are predominantly just either single story or just really the residential structures of the homes. So that's an unlikely situation for them to become legally permissible. Anytime Fitness would be a permitted use by right, so they would go from a CUP to permitted principal use because of the fact that we've got residential above the commercial use. So that would work for Anytime Fitness, but it's essentially the same between the two.
And what's the parking requirement that goes with the mixed commercial?
The UMC is just 50% of the required under the code.
Okay, so it's a better parking situation than GB.
It is. GB
I mean,
just,
in terms of
in terms of reduction of on-street parking requirements. Yeah, the GB is the full whatever is required in the table. The UMC was specifically a 50% reduction of the table requirements for the code.
So, Bill, you've said several times to kind of leave off St. John. Would it be St. John Hardware, sorry.
Yeah.
Would it be possible to imagine the zone going up the alley, the zone line going up the alley?
Yeah.
So you could leave both the triangular piece of St. John Hardware where they store their equipment off, and as well as North Jackson.
Correct. When I was asking Mike to take a look at this, that's really what I had asked him to take a look at, but he felt that we really ought to be assessing what was over on Jackson as well. But certainly that does not have to be included as part of any consideration or action. We still have the same conflicts with three of the principal uses in the location, depending upon the zoning district that you'd be looking at applying. And so that does present some challenges or some things we need to carefully evaluate.
I have a newbie question. What's the goal of the rezone?
Well, I think at this point in time,
I was going to ask that. It's not a newbie question.
I think we were evaluating to see whether the existing zoning helps facilitate achieving the council's goal of expanding the perceived downtown area up north. And that, I think that's really the question. If that is truly the council's goal and vision, is they want to expand the perceived downtown area north, then does the zoning support that?
And what would be the benefit of that, of the perception of the expanded downtown? Counselor?
I generally don't say anything at these meetings. I think it would probably come under the idea of trying to partially would be to help beautify, help make the north entrance to Moscow more appealing, and maybe to clean it up a little bit. That would probably be, from my point of view, that would be probably the one real, if there was a real advantage, that would be it. The people that are there are already there, so We're not going to get rid of them, but we could possibly put in some trees, kind of make it, I would say, more of a gradual entrance, because as you're coming down, you can see it. But if it were to be brightened up a little bit,
Yeah.
just, I would think that would be the, from my point of view anyway, just 1 out of 6. But that's the advantage I would see. I don't see much of an advantage from a commercial point of view or from a point of view of business, since we've got the setbacks on one side, don't have the setbacks on the other, and there are some things that you can't change, but you can beautify it a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, because that was kind of what I was thinking too, is that the big factor out there is, that's, you're never going to get it, for lack of a better word, cozy like the actual downtown core is, just because of the major north-south highway in Idaho runs right through it. But yeah, that makes more sense, because I can see that as you're coming down the hill. I mean, you do have the whole thing is laid out there right before you, so.
Yeah, I think there's an aesthetic aspect of it. There is, if the city's going to make an investment in improving infrastructure, planting trees, I think you could see a property valuation increase, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you could address the setback issue with the structures and remove the threat of, if they got destroyed, they couldn't be reconstructed in that form, you could increase some property value.
Yeah.
And possibly incentivize more investment in the area. I don't think you're never, like, I think it's very true, you're never going to make it like Main Street, just because of the way the roadway section functions there. It's just.
That's an interesting thought, though. I mean, if we were using this term perceived, and so we're talking about folks that drive into Moscow and how they perceive the city, and but perception works both ways. So if, even folks that already are here and sort of start perceiving that as more of the kind of downtown, I mean, I could see that, I don't know, maybe people start raising their expectations or working together more on what the city looks like, or, I don't know.
Well, it seems like some of the business owners have started to do that. So I would say Anytime Fitness, by trying to be a mixed-use property and a zero, basically almost a zero setback rate.
Yeah,
It is a zero setback.
It is zero
It's
setback.
changing the
Yeah.
pattern that's the typical strip development setback from the highway, widen the corridor. And same with Han Rental. They could have chosen to redevelop that property when it burned differently, but I thought it was pretty cool that they decided to be a little more urban in their in the way they went about it, and it certainly helps improve the visual
Yep, they cleaned
perception
it up
on.
a lot.
And so that's two business owners that are changing the pattern and had to fight the zoning code to be able to do it. So I guess I don't agree that it's only just aesthetic. I think it's also a business decision that they're making, that they want to be maybe more considered part of downtown than just a commercial strip.
Joel, did you have a thought?
I think there is also a possible commercial benefit in terms of possibility of intensification of use if the narrower setbacks were allowed to put more square footage of building.
Yeah, because that looked like the big problem to me with a lot of the existing buildings, that if you had to rebuild them actually with the 10-foot setback, most of them you'd lose 10 foot of building.
Right.
Yeah.
So, while I agree, John, that the folks who are there, there's also some amount of transition in parts of that neighborhood. There's some businesses, the transmission shop, is it really in business? I mean, it looks so, it's the glass place
As far
next
as I
to it.
know, the
It's-
auto body
Auto
transitioned
body is-
over. Yeah, so the The
Okay.
auto body shop has transitioned into a new use.
And across from the recycling center, we got a building built into that
That's
lot.
Correct.
So and to the extent that there's change, which is slow in Moscow, but if we got the zoning the way we wanted it, we might imagine over the next 10, 15 years that some things would adjust relative to that.
Those residential, one is an apartment building that is falling down, but it's still fully rented all the time. And then there's a couple little houses on the other side, on the west side, that are in better shape, and they're just about always rented. But eventually, yeah, they're going to cost too much to keep up, that whoever owns them is going to, take them down and either put up something else or sell the property or whatever.
If you're just looking at aesthetics, I appreciate the commercial aspect, that makes sense. If you're just looking at aesthetics, is there any reason the city can't address the aesthetics given the current zoning designation?
From the perspective of improvements in the right-of-way?
The trees.
The trees. Yeah, and that's kind of an independent aspect here. In that goal, there were kind of multiple layers of actually the streetscape design, but also looking if the intent was to really try to, expand the perception of Main Street. A significant aspect of that is the building wall and how they relate to the roadway. And so that's why we incorporated an aspect of at least a review of the zoning to determine whether the zoning that exists there today is the best thing to achieve what the council's hoping. There is nothing that's precluding the city from pursuing, and as part of the beautification project we're working on right now, we actually are programming street trees up the corridor. That I think is going to happen regardless of this review. If the review determines that the zoning that's there is appropriate and fits and stays, then that's it. The other aspects will continue as part of the goal. But we did want to have at least an opportunity for the commission to review the corridor, consider whether any changes are appropriate, and make those recommendations to the council.
Yeah, kind of if we can exert steady, gentle pressure to go ahead and build buildings right up on the street and things like that, over the course of 20 years, it would make a difference.
Okay, thanks.
Good, yeah, good questions. I'm reminded one other thing was that following Wendy's students' presentation, I left discouraged to some extent at the thought of the difficulty of extending the Main Street experience north. But subsequently, I looked at the Jackson Street experience. There is a 3-lane roadway, and there's a big chunk of it north of 3rd that has a good tree canopy and a lot of the character that makes it attractive as a pedestrian space and as a space to drive through compared to the North Main piece. That peters out when you get down by the Jackson Street parking lot, and it peters out further as you get down there to American West Bank and stuff. But I think that we could look and say there are other places where we have Highway 95 and some of Washington also has a tree canopied experience on a 3-lane road. So it doesn't have to be the more idyllic Main Street with 2 lanes and diagonal parking.
Yeah, what they've got going for them, though, is they only have half of Highway 95. As opposed to a pretty good chunk of this.
As opposed to having 5 lanes.
Yeah.
2 lanes plus the turn lane, yeah. But anyway, other thoughts before we move on?
I think part of my perception of North Main, and it becomes most strong as I'm driving North Main by the Rosars parking lot is everybody turning everywhere. The turning, the traffic turning patterns associated with the various couplets coming in, you suffer angst as Washington joins Maine, and again when Jackson branches off there, and the various turns into the various entrances into the Rosars parking lot and into the drugstore and so on, create a very, very different experience for a driver.
Would that change if, over time, if the zone did change and the zero setback was actually allowed, and that Rosars parking lot accepted some new development along the corridor, then all of a sudden you're closing in the corridor and you're channeling where traffic goes and giving it some reference in space. I mean, I talk about that intersection where the Troy Highway intersects the couplet, and it's like, I mean, I've lived here a long time and I've seen that intersection change, and still to this day I don't know where I am when I hit that intersection. It's just the geography of nowhere. And so having some, buildings that start to give you
one of my favorite awful intersections is the jog of the dotted line up in the top of there, and I use it regularly as I come and go. But
and you ask yourself, do you feel lucky?
That's a good way to say it.
I boycotted it for a while after I served on a jury for a personal injury lawsuit involving that intersection where somebody got hit, but I still use it.
It's kind of my only route to the brewery, so I have to.
Okay. All right. Well,
but I do think the traffic movements there could be improved, and maybe Wendy's point would be helpful, but.
Well, it's really difficult. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Let's go back. If there was an opportunity to straighten out this intersection, that would alleviate that issue. If you could consolidate down to 2 points of access rather than 3 on Rosars, that would really help. There's kind of, right now, 3 approaches. There's a lot of activity from D to E. It's just, especially if it's a PM.
And traffic is just slowing down, coming down the hill.
If it's 5 o'clock right after work, there's just a lot of things happening. People heading to Red Box at Walgreens, or heading to Rosars, or making it's just a.
I think I was very disappointed by the state reconstruction of that segment, that it did not do some things which could have improved it, but it didn't.
That's one of the most, I'm going to say, polite intersections in town. I used to live down there, and I used to work down there, and I think it almost became mandatory, if you lived and worked down there, that you gave every break you could, and then you accepted every break that people gave you. And there have been a few close ones, and every now and then there's a wreck, but for a jog in the middle of coming down the hill at a fairly good speed, people do seem to kind of watch where they're going, keep the foot on the brake, and because it can be a mess.
And the personal injury case involved a question as to whether the car coming southbound toward E there was actually intending to turn onto E, or intending to turn into the first Rosars parking lot entrance. Lots of people have their turn signal on well before they get there, and the guy pulling out of E misinterpreted the turn signal.
That can happen in any short
Yes.
block length kind of environment, yeah. To send readings that you think might be interesting along those lines to Bill.
It's a great idea.
All right. Any last item for the good of the order before we adjourn? Okay, we're adjourned.